Alzheimer's disease is a neurodegenerative disease, so instead of there being steps, it's a slowly progressive disease. Did you have a car accident? Do you have low thyroid, low B12? Do you have strokes? If you rule that stuff out, then what you're left with, 60 to 80% is Alzheimer's disease. The one that actually kills brain cells is inflammation. And it turns out that the way chemotherapy agents work is they reduce the proliferation of cells. A number of papers, including one I'm on, suggesting that prior chemotherapy can actually be protective against Alzheimer's. We think you can reduce the risk of getting Alzheimer's by at least 50% by lifestyle changes. It also turns out that even amongst the lifestyle stuff like controlling blood pressure, it turns out hypertension is a big risk factor for Alzheimer's also. I think Alzheimer's is the worst disease there is. You could say cancer is deadly. That's a bad disease. But in Alzheimer's disease, the problem is the loved ones watch the person with the disease losing brain cells a few a week, and they become less and less aware of the fact that they've got a disease.
The season of health is on cruise through HTX. And a brief reminder before we get started to please, for the love of all things sacred, talk to your primary care physician before trying anything you hear during any of these episodes this season. Dr. Schultz, let's start with the basics. What are Alzheimer's disease and dementia?
Very good question. Dementia is sort of the superordinate, and it just means someone has cognitive impairment. Could be memory loss, getting lost, whatever. And it's affecting their daily life, so they can't drive now because of that. Alzheimer's disease is one cause of dementia. You might have dementia because you were in a bad car accident and had traumatic brain injury.
Gotcha.
That would be a static dementia. It doesn't change over time because you got the injury and it stays that way. You could have strokes where each time a person gets a stroke, they get worse. Alzheimer's disease is a neurodegenerative disease, so instead of there being steps, it's a slowly progressive disease. If you rule out, did you have a car accident? Do you have low thyroid, low B12? Do you have strokes? If you rule that stuff out, then what you're left with, 60 to 80% is Alzheimer's disease. So it's a lot of people. It's like 7 million Americans, at least 50 million people worldwide that we know of.
And that is a lot, and it's only expected to grow. We met through Dr. Patton, and what he said was astounding, something like 6.9 million, I think, by 2040 or something like that. Like a lot.
Yeah. Well, it doubles in incidence every 5 years we live longer. So that as heart disease, cancer, and stroke are coming under better control, the average American is living 5 years longer now than 30 years ago.
Okay.
That means the incidence doubles. And with the baby boomers, of which I'm one, there's a lot of us.
I don't buy that for a second, but go ahead, please.
There's a lot of us, and as we're aging, I think what Dr. Patton was saying is the number of people who have Alzheimer's in the United States now will double over the next few years as the baby boomers get older.
Because you're living longer.
Yeah.
And something's got to give, because nobody lives forever.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the brain is the one that's left after you take care of heart disease, cancer, and stroke.
Right. So we talk about Alzheimer's, and during episode 1 of season 2 of the show, I had Dr. Patton on, and we talked about preventative measures and all that sort of a thing, and how the disease, it's too late when you find out you have it, because this is something that has been brewing for a long, long time. But going back to what you said about heart disease, stroke, cancer, and whatnot, do you find that, let's just say John Doe has cancer, stage 1 lung cancer, beats it. Whatever the survival rate is, does having that accelerate his likelihood of getting it?
It's a really good question. It turns out that one of the steps that we believe is involved in Alzheimer's disease, in fact, it's the last in a series of steps, the one that actually kills brain cells is inflammation. And it turns out that the way chemotherapy agents work is they reduce the proliferation of cells, right? You got a cancer here, it's growing, You want to reduce that. They also reduce the proliferation of the white blood cells, the immune cells. So ironically, there's actually a number of papers, including one I'm on, suggesting that prior chemotherapy can actually be protective against Alzheimer's.
Oh.
Because it's anti-inflammatory, we believe.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah. Now, it is true there are certain chemotherapy agents that do have a direct impact on the brain, and they're not good. And so we will see someone, they've been on chemo for 6 months, and now they have cognitive impairment. But for the people who make it through and who are fine, a lot of them actually have a reduced risk of getting Alzheimer's.
Something I didn't have that on my bingo card walking into this interview.
No, it's all shocking. And there's a whole school of biomedical informatics at UT and a school of public health. It's hundreds of people who like to study data and statistics.
Yeah.
And I work with them, and we come up with this kind of stuff, and it's like, oh my God, seeing people in clinic, I could never figure that out. I see 1,000 people a year or whatever.
I'm sorry, you see 1,000 people a year.
Yeah, or more than that probably. But
Wow.
but when you do database analyses, you can look at 93 million Americans.
Yeah.
And then you can say, well, who had cancer and when did they have it and what was the outcome and who got dementia after that, controlling for other factors. And we come up with stuff like that. It turns out these 3 chemotherapy agents are actually protective against Alzheimer's. Really shocking, and it's part of what makes this so interesting and rewarding too, because we can use this kind of knowledge to have a positive impact on people's risk for Alzheimer's.
And it also gives you that validation that, hey, we're not just looking at stats. These stats mean something, and here's how we can apply them, because you can only it's one thing to have knowledge, but having the knowledge, deploying it worldwide.
Yes.
And saving people.
Yeah, and I don't know what Dr. Patton talked about, but we think you can reduce the risk of getting Alzheimer's by at least 50% by lifestyle changes.
Right.
And then there's other things like cancer chemotherapy. It also turns out that even amongst the lifestyle stuff like controlling blood pressure, that's a commonly known risk factor for cardiovascular disease, right? Heart disease and stroke. It turns out hypertension's a big risk factor for Alzheimer's also.
No way.
Yeah. And then it turns out that certain blood pressure pills are better at reducing the risk of Alzheimer's than other ones are.
Because they reduce inflammation?
We don't know how they work, but we have several papers now that I'm on with people at UT there showing that like there's things called ARBs. They work on a certain receptor to reduce blood pressure. So you take people, you give them 5 different blood pressure pills. They all reduce the blood pressure the same amount. This one will have the least likelihood of getting Alzheimer's. Huh. So they're not created equal. They're doing probably something as a side effect. We don't know if it's inflammation. Could be, but it could be something else too. You get all these epidemiologic findings you can then use. Like now if I see someone in clinic with Alzheimer's who's got mild hypertension, I put them on an ARB, because I know that's going to reduce their risk of progression more than other blood pressure pills.
And is that the name of the medication, or is that an abbreviation?
It's a category.
Category. Okay, so what is that?
Angiotensin receptor blockers, ARBs.
Say that 5 times fast.
Right. So
There'll be a pop quiz at the end.
One of the ways you get high blood pressure is your kidneys put out hormones that tell my body the blood pressure is too low, raise it up. And as we get older, it doesn't work so well, and a lot of people get high blood pressure, right, hypertension. Well, anyway, one of the ways it does raise your blood pressure is through different receptors, and smart scientists have figured out, hey, if we give someone something that blocks that receptor, it reduces their blood pressure. And then we find out it not only reduces blood pressure, but certain categories actually reduce the risk of Alzheimer's more than others do. Oh. Yeah.
So this is all fascinating stuff, but what has been the one thing, if you could narrow it down, it might be like picking a favorite child, but I'm going to ask you anyway, what is your favorite discovery in recent years?
Oh my God, that's an easy one, actually, it turns
out. Okay,
all
right.
There's so many things going on that it's a really great time to be studying this. But without a doubt, the most important finding is that we knew all this stuff about preventing Alzheimer's, but once someone got it, we didn't know what to do. There was nothing really effective. And now we have 2 medicines that have a significant impact on the progression of the disease. And it's very obvious to me in clinics seeing people that they're doing a lot better than people used to do when I would follow them for a while.
Okay.
And I don't know if you want me to go into details, but Alzheimer's is really started by amyloid plaques depositing in the brain.
Okay, so let me ask you this. When you talk about amyloid plaques, now I think of plaques in terms of, well, not just teeth, but also plaques building up in your veins and your blood vessels.
Arteries, yeah.
Arteries, there you go, arteries.
Yeah.
So is that very similar, like the more you get, the worse it is?
Oh, that's a good question. So it turns out as scientists, we use the word plaque just to mean a deposit.
Okay.
So yeah, there's deposit in blood vessels that gives you a heart attack.
Right, clogs it up.
But there's deposits in the brain that aren't related to that. They're also called amyloid because it's a bunch of schmutz. It's a bunch of stuff that we didn't get rid of fast enough, and it accumulated.
Okay.
And when we only lived to be 30, up to 1,000 or even a few hundred years ago, it didn't matter that there was stuff that accumulated that we couldn't get rid of efficiently. But now that we live to 70, 80, 90, if we don't get rid of everything right away, it starts to accumulate in the brain. And one of those proteins that accumulates is a normal brain protein, but it doesn't get metabolized 100%. And there's a small fraction of it, 5%, that's very chemically sticky. And that starts to accumulate. And after a few decades, it gives people symptoms. It's kind of like if I take out the garbage on Monday, but I only take out 95%. And then the next week I take out 95%. And the next week, eventually my garage will fill up.
Compounding.
Compounding, exactly. That's what's the plaques are doing.
Wow.
And those amyloid plaques, there's a lot of them. I mean, a ton of them. We can see them on an amyloid PET scan. So there's got to be a lot of them to show up on a PET scan. We can see them accumulating in the brain up to 10 or 20 years before someone has their first symptom.
Of Alzheimer's.
Yes, exactly. So it's going on over decades. And that 5% is accumulating over decades till other things get set in motion, we believe. Other protein products, inflammation, etc. That's when people come in to see us. The new to answer your question, the new meds we have do what? They get rid of plaques from the brain. And they're really effective at it. I mean, I see someone and their brain is full of amyloid.
Okay.
And 6, 12, 18 months later, when I do another amyloid PET scan, boom, nothing.
Huh.
I still get shocked. I've been seeing it for a couple of years now, but I still get shocked. I pull it up and I'm like, oh my God, look at that. You've got no amyloid that we can see in your brain right now.
And so this is, because you talk about this as being a preventive medication, so you can have these plaques in your brain and not have
Symptoms.
Alzheimer's.
Right. You have the plaques developing over a long time, and then you get Alzheimer's.
Okay, so what's the typical age range of someone that's on these medications? Got to be 50s, as early as 50s, maybe 60s?
So you've got a very good idea there. There's two parts to that. We're using the meds now for people who have symptoms. You have to start with the people, to get approval, of course. You don't want to take a potentially toxic med and give it to people with no symptoms.
True.
So we start out giving it to people with symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
And now we have two meds that dramatically impact the course of things if you have symptoms.
Gotcha.
But you correctly intuited the next step, which we're already doing, is we have, just us alone, have 4 trials of medications on people with no symptoms, but who have amyloid plaques developing. The idea being that we think that once people have symptoms and we put them on medicine, they're already 20-some years into the disease.
Right.
So the idea now is we're picking up people that are 5 or 10 years in and giving them the medicines to see if we can't reduce their risk of getting it, or maybe someday prevent it, is our fantasy.
And that's what Dr. Patton and I had spoken about during our previous episode, is working out, using your brain, loading up on B vitamins, mindset. Mm-hmm. And this is some of the stuff that he talks about on his podcast, Your Health, Your Wealth, is that there are ways to just not even go there.
Yes, all of those preventive items are right. Valuable, and I still tell everybody, do that.
Nature's the best medicine.
Yes, but on top of that, I'm going to give you this medicine if you agree to it,
right?
And placebo-controlled, and we're going to see if the people on the drug don't have a reduced risk of getting the disease.
What is the most insidious part of either Alzheimer's or dementia, or both of them, that you've seen that you knew going into this you were going to have some dark days?
Oh, yeah. Oh, it's real obvious to me. So, pardon me, the
No.
grandkids gave me a cold this week. The worst, I think Alzheimer's is the worst disease there is. You could say cancer. Cancer's deadly. That's a bad disease. But during the whole treatment process, you and your spouse are going through it together. The family goes through it together. Eventually, you lose the person. It's terrible. In Alzheimer's disease, the problem is the loved ones watch the person with the disease losing brain cells a few a week, and they become less and less aware of the fact that they've got a disease. They start forgetting who their spouse is. They start arguing about the treatment because if I don't recognize I've got Alzheimer's disease, why would I want a IV therapy or even an oral medicine, you know? And it just tears the heart of people out when they watch their loved one disappearing a few brain cells at a time. That's the worst part of the disease by far. And that's the most motivating part to us, to keep looking for better treatments, to try to reduce the chances that people in the future are going to have to go through this nasty disease.
You know, you talk about family and how they are the caretakers, and they're the ones that are watching their loved one go through this. And it reminds me of something a long, long time ago when I was living in Minneapolis and doing radio over there, and one of the radio hosts had said something very cavalierly about how he hoped that he would get Alzheimer's because it just seemed to be like, I guess it was his trying to remember how he had said it, but it was something to the effect of, well, I won't know that I'm dying.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that sounds both awesome and terrible.
All at the same time.
All at the same time.
Freddie, let me ask you, just by an analogy, let's
Please.
say, so it's a very distressing disease, even to the person.
Oh, yeah.
Even if they don't know they have it. I'll give you an example. What if while we're sitting here, I said, Freddie, how'd you get here today? And it turned out with Alzheimer's, you don't remember anything more than 3 minutes ago. Oh. I don't know how I got here. What are you doing here today? I don't know. There must have been something that told me to come here today and talk to you. They get really anxious and depressed because they can't remember anything more than a couple minutes ago. And it's like finding yourself somewhere and not knowing how you got there and why you're there. And then eventually you start to forget who people are, like you even forget who your own spouse is. Could you imagine looking at your spouse and saying, and this happens a lot, people will tell me, oh, he doesn't know who I am, so he's distressed that I'm in the house with him. And he, normally you take a shower, you come out, you get dressed, you're used to doing that around your spouse. If you didn't know who that was.
Who's this naked person in my bedroom?
Right. Or I'm not going to be naked in front of this stranger.
Oh, jeez.
So it's just one distressing event after another. So yeah, with all due respect to the gentleman, I understand what he's saying. If I don't know what's going on, maybe there's some blessing there, but there's a lot of bad parts to it also.
Right, especially for the people who are taking care of the patient.
Both people are stressed.
Both people. Yeah.
Freddie, we actually have about a half a dozen studies of caregivers. And it turns out we find physiologic changes in their bodies because of the stress of taking care of the loved one. There's more inflammation in their bodies. Mm-hmm. There's more changes in oxygen utilization. All kinds of stuff. Literally physical changes in their bodies related to the stress of dealing with someone who's forgetting them. And you can imagine, when my wife stubs her toe, I feel terrible for her, right? But could you imagine if I saw her going through this, how distressful I would be?
All the things that you just talked about happening to the most important person in your life.
Exactly.
Is just...
Yeah, it's terrible.
Yeah.
You wouldn't wish it on anybody.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
But, again, back to family. How likely is it that somebody whose parent or parents that has it, how likely is a son or a daughter to have it?
Yeah, that's a really important question, and people come in all the time asking about that. So it turns out there's one gene that we know of that's probably relevant to 60% of Alzheimer's.
Okay.
So there are some families that have the gene, and the younger members would be at risk then. Those are actually the people that we're putting into pre-symptomatic trials. In other words, how are you going to find people who are at risk for Alzheimer's in the real world? Mm-hmm. The way I do it is I look at mom in clinic today, and I say, well, she's 80, and she's got 2 kids that are 56 and 58. And there's a chance they'll have the gene that she's got, but they're normal now, bringing mom in. And I say to them, hey, there is some risk related to mom. I never want to freak people out by saying what that is exactly,
yeah,
of course. But there is some risk, and they're kind of aware of that themselves. what would you think about us testing you to see whether you're accumulating this stuff? And if you are, what would you think about being in a study to see if we can't reduce the risk of it? So to answer your question, yeah, we think about 60% may run in families, and the other 40% is things we don't know about. Or, as I say, high blood pressure that wasn't controlled, high cholesterol, high triglycerides, all that stuff are risk factors. Getting bumped on the head's a risk factor. Lifelong depression's a risk factor. Living in the southern United States is a risk factor, probably because the food's so damn good here.
Well, yeah, that is true.
They got nothing on us up north.
Yeah, yeah, that is true. You talk about being bumped on the head. This is a very selfish question, and I've brought this up more than once during this season. It's the season of health and wealth and cruise through HTX. And so I played football from aged 8 to 18, so 10 years.
Yeah.
Very, very important developmental years. As I know, the prefrontal cortex doesn't fully form until you're in your mid-20s.
Yes.
So imagine my horror when, oh my goodness, me and my friends are banging our heads at a very young age, whether hard or soft or soft. But I'm wondering for someone like me who we only played Pee-wee, middle school, and high school football, go on to live lives. What is the likelihood that someone like us, a relatively healthy person, ends up with either Alzheimer's or dementia? What are the risk factors or what are the symptoms that we should be looking out for? Should we donate our brains to science? I know I want to. I mean, I'm dead serious.
Okay.
My family knows this. All the things.
Yeah. No, that's a really good and complicated question. Let me give you an analogy here. The brain, if you touch it, feels like Jell-O. That's how hard it is, or soft it is.
Have you ever touched a brain?
Oh, yeah. But you got to be careful. It's so soft that if you put your finger on it too hard, you're like, oops. So it's really fragile. So the first question is, if I told you that the brain is like Jell-O and you're running down a field, the football field, with a plate of Jell-O, what would you say would be the maximum impact you would want to have on that?
Oh, you wouldn't want to have any impact.
Nothing. Exactly.
I'm thinking of J.J. Watt destroying it, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So that gives you an idea of how fragile it is. Now, in the other end of the spectrum, by the time we're 90, we think half of people will have Alzheimer's. It's that common. So there's a lot of things that we know of, like trauma to the brain, that increase the risk. But ultimately, humans are at high risk anyway. But when I see someone in clinic who's 60 and not 80, sometimes it turns out they had a bad trauma to the brain. Sometimes it's one of the other risk factors. I'll give you an example. There was some twins I followed, identical twins. And the one twin got Alzheimer's around 65. The other lived to 90, and identical twin never got Alzheimer's. Now, you don't know all the things they're exposed to during life, but it turns out the twin that got Alzheimer's had the terrible luck of being in several car accidents where she was knocked out.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Oh, that's horrible.
So in that case, we would say, okay, 3 times getting knocked out, maybe that was relevant. It's hard to say 100% certainty. Yeah. But so that gives you an idea. There's probably certain cases where it's relevant. But I hate to freak people out because we've all had our bell rung.
Yeah.
Through various,
Oh, right.
So getting your bell rung is probably not a good idea. Avoid it if you can. But in the other direction, if you're riding a bicycle, wear a helmet. If you're skiing, wear a helmet. I get petrified when I see someone going down the ski hill without a helmet on. Like, oh my God, and then wear your seatbelt in the car. You don't have to wear a football helmet in the car, but at least wear a seatbelt so you reduce the risk of hitting your head.
Around Houston, it might not be a bad idea to wear a football helmet. These people.
That's exactly
right.
Well,
actually, you know what? I take that back. We're never driving because the traffic is so bad.
Yes. When your maximum speed is 5 miles per hour.
It's really, what damage?
What can go wrong?
What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah.
Wow. One final question that I have for you. One of my other podcast production clients, this is The Rose, and so Dr. Dixie Melillo talked about Alzheimer's as being called now type 3 diabetes, diabetes of the brain.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
No, it's a really good question and good point. So there is this normal brain protein that when it's worn out, we break it down, And the last 5% I mentioned is very chemically sticky, and that's what forms the plaques. Okay. Now, it turns out that we have about a half a dozen ways of getting rid of that little fragment before it forms a plaque. And one of them is there's an enzyme in the brain called insulin-degrading enzyme.
Insulin-degrading enzyme. Okay.
That's capable of cleaving it so that it doesn't stick. So it's one of the 6 mechanisms of getting rid of this stuff. Well, guess what insulin-degrading enzyme also does for you? Degrades insulin. Why is insulin important? That's what goes up in diabetics to try to get the sugar out of the blood into the cells. So in people with diabetes, it turns out their insulin level is very high as they're trying to lower their sugar. It just doesn't work very well. So they need insulin and other ways of enhancing that. But we think what happens then is that the insulin-degrading enzyme spends more time degrading insulin and less time degrading amyloid. So there is a potential connection between diabetes and Alzheimer's, hence the term type 3 diabetes.
Wow. And you don't have to go there if you just skip dessert. Not just kidding.
Yes.
I mean, not really kidding, but
Yes.
part way.
Yes. No, since all of the things that are risk factors for Alzheimer's are also risk factors for vascular disease, I tell people all the time, the good news is you can have all the green beans you want. The bad news is you can't put anything on them that tastes good. No butter, no bacon, so no cheesecake.
No cheesecake.
All of those things.
No fun allowed.
Right. Yes.
Oh man, but it really, and it really goes back to Dr. Schultz using food as a tool, as a fuel, and not using it as an escape or using it for pleasure. Although we're humans, we're hardwired for that.
I know. I gave a talk last night at a steakhouse. Everybody was eating steaks. I was like, if you really want to lower your risk, maybe you want to get the salmon.
Why don't we just have the next meeting at Salada?
Yes.
Jeez.
Yeah, I was a good boy. I ordered the salmon and took it home. But sometimes I'm not a good boy. But yeah, as humans, I mean, steak is unbelievable.
Yeah, really.
But it's got all the wrong stuff in it for Alzheimer's disease.
Man, it's so good.
It's so good, yeah.
And you put a cheesecake in front of me afterward? Come on, how am I going to say no to that?
I know. This woman next to me, Dr. Schultz, you only live once. Go for it. I'm like, I've got the good cop on this shoulder, and I've got her, the bad cop, on this shoulder, saying, just go for it. It can't hurt you.
What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah.
Oh, goodness. Well, Dr. Schultz, it has been so much fun talking to you, and I really appreciate the time you have taken out of your day. All the things you've got going on in your world, you've chosen to be here on this podcast, and so thank you so much.
Oh, thank you very much, Freddie. It's a real pleasure talking about this stuff, and honestly, I think what you and I are going to hopefully do is influence some people.
Yeah.
Just a little bit to get a little better lifestyle and to get, diagnosed sooner than later.
Where can my friends find you?
Oh, at UT. I'm on the web, Paul Schultz at UT Health, and my whole clinic is on the web. Let us know if you're interested in research or being evaluated, and just send us an email, and we'll sort it out. We'll get you in.
I'm donating my brain to Dr. Schultz.
Okay. But save it for a few more decades.
A few more decades.
Yes. We don't want to rush anything.
Yeah, definitely not rushing.
Yeah.
All right.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.
All right.
All right. Bye-bye.